I'm a 34-year-old guy, and right now I'm in the middle of a situation I never thought I'd find myself in. My parents divorced when I was 12, so my brother and I mainly grew up with our mom. Dad was around, but more like an occasional presence than a steady figure. He'd show up on holidays, make the effort to come to a few school events, but he wasn't what you'd call involved. When I was a kid, I just accepted it as the way things were. He wasn't a bad dad, just not always there. Now, he's in his late 60s, and a couple of weeks ago he had a massive heart attack. It came out of nowhere. One moment he was living on his own, doing his thing, and the next, I got a call saying he was in the ICU, hooked up to all these machines. I rushed to the hospital, but my brother, who's 2 years younger than me, didn't show up. He said he had his reasons, but it's been days, and he hasn't stepped foot in that place once. It's tearing me apart. The doctors don't really know what's going to happen with Dad. Some days they're more optimistic, and other days it's like they're preparing me for the worst. He's conscious sometimes, drifting in and out, barely strong enough to speak more than a few words. The guy who used to be so stubborn and self-assured now looks small and fragile. I've been visiting him almost every day, sitting in that sterile hospital room, watching the machines beep and his chest rise and fall. It's weird how quickly life can flip everything upside down. And then there's my brother. He's got a stubborn streak like Dad, maybe even more so. When I told him about the heart attack, he just went quiet for a long moment. Then he said he wasn't coming. No explanation, no discussion, just, I'm not going. I didn't know how to react at first. It was like he'd dropped a bomb and walked away from the fallout. I've tried talking to him a few times since, but all he'll say is, it's complicated. He won't give me more than that, and I'm starting to wonder if he ever will. Our mom, who's been divorced from Dad for over 2 decades, has tried to stay out of it. She's one of those people who doesn't like to rock the boat. She told us to do what feels right for each of us, to follow our hearts, whatever that means. But honestly, it doesn't help much. It just feels like she's avoiding taking sides, and it leaves me standing there trying to figure out if I'm being unreasonable for expecting my brother to show up, or if he's being unfair to leave me to handle all of this alone. Seeing Dad like this is, I don't know how to describe it. He was never the warmest person, but he was tough. Even when he was distant, he had this air of being unbreakable. Now, I'm watching him struggle to even form words. A few days ago, he asked me why my brother hasn't come. He looked so confused, like he couldn't understand why his son wouldn't be there. I tried to change the subject, mumbling something about work keeping him busy, but I could see the hurt in his eyes. That look hasn't left my mind since. I've talked to a few friends about it. Some say I should respect my brother's choice. They think it's his right to stay away if he has his reasons, but others think he's being selfish, letting me carry the burden alone while our dad's life hangs in the balance. I feel like I'm caught in the middle, trying to navigate this mess without knowing what's right. Part of me wants to scream at my brother to just show up for once, and the other part wants to understand whatever's holding him back. Out of desperation, I started reading up on estranged families and people who cut ties with their parents. I found all these articles and posts online, stories of people who couldn't bring themselves to see a parent before they passed, and it made me wonder if there's more to my brother's silence than he's letting on. I keep thinking, is there something I missed all these years? Some resentment he's been carrying that I didn't see? Meanwhile, everything else in my life is slipping through the cracks. Work is a blur, I barely sleep anymore, and my brain just won't shut off. Every time my phone buzzes, I half expect it to be the hospital calling with bad news. A few nights ago, it actually happened. They called to say Dad's condition had worsened. I panicked, grabbed my keys, and sped to the hospital, hoping I'd get there in time. I ended up breaking down in the car on the way back, and I called my brother, begging him to come, but all I got was another cold, I can't. I didn't know where else to turn, so I decided to post on Reddit. It's crazy, but strangers on the internet sometimes have a way of giving you perspective you can't get from the people in your life. Maybe they'd help me figure out how to deal with all this, or at least help me make sense of why my brother is acting the way he is. I just needed someone, anyone, to say something that would make it all click. That's where things are right now. I'm spending my days in the hospital, watching my dad fight for each breath, while my brother stays miles away, holding on to whatever it is that keeps him from walking through those doors. I have no idea how this is going to end, and honestly, I'm scared. Scared for my dad, scared for my brother, and scared that whatever's between us now might break our family for good. Update 1. A couple of days after I posted about the situation on Reddit, I got a text from my brother. He asked if I could meet him at a cafe near his place. It wasn't much, but it was the first time he'd reached out since Dad was admitted to the hospital. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my jacket, headed out, and drove over, my mind racing with what this might mean. Was he finally ready to visit, or was this just another conversation that would go nowhere? When I got to the cafe, he was already sitting at a table by the window, staring out into the street. He looked tired, like he hadn't been sleeping well either. I took a seat across from him, and we both sat there in awkward silence for a few minutes. It felt like we were both trying to figure out how to start. Then, he finally began talking, and it wasn't what I expected. He told me that he couldn't bring himself to visit Dad, not after everything that happened when we were kids. He started bringing up stuff I hadn't thought about in years, how Dad missed his high school graduation, how he skipped birthdays and barely showed up to any of his soccer games. To him, it wasn't just that Dad wasn't around much. It was that every time he was supposed to be there, he wasn't. He said he spent so many years waiting for Dad to show up and prove that he cared, but it never happened. I sat there, stunned. I knew Dad wasn't the most reliable when we were growing up, but I'd always thought my brother and I had moved past that we'd accepted it and moved on. But listening to him now, it was clear he'd been carrying this anger for a long time, and I guess I never noticed just how deep it went. As he kept talking, I realized it wasn't just about Dad's past mistakes. It was about how seeing Dad now, so vulnerable, would bring all those old feelings back. It would remind him of a man who never made an effort when it mattered, and now that time was running out, he couldn't just forget all that pain. He admitted he'd been avoiding me too because he knew I'd try to convince him to come, and he didn't want to hear it. That's when things started to get heated. I told him he was being cold-hearted, that whatever Dad did or didn't do back then, this might be our last chance to be there for him. My brother snapped back that I'd always been blind to the way Dad treated us, that I'd made excuses for him. He said it wasn't fair of me to push him to forgive just because I'd managed to let it go. For a moment, I thought he might walk out right then and there, but he just sat there, staring at his coffee like it held the answer to all our problems. Finally, he just said he couldn't do it. He wouldn't visit, and he didn't want to keep talking about it. He stood up, tossed a few bills on the table, and left without looking back. I stayed behind, feeling like I'd just been sucker punched. I thought I understood my brother, but clearly, I'd been missing a huge part of the story. When I got home, our mom called me. She must have sensed the tension between us because she started sharing a few stories from when they were still married. She talked about how Dad had a habit of pulling back whenever things got tough, how he'd shut himself off from the family even when he was physically there. It was stuff I'd forgotten, or maybe never fully noticed as a kid. Hearing it now, I could see how my brother might have taken those moments harder than I did. The next day, I got a bit of good news, well, as good as it gets in this situation. The doctors managed to stabilize Dad's condition. He still wasn't out of the woods, but at least he wasn't getting worse. It gave me a little more time to think, to try to make sense of everything that had happened. I ended up sending my brother a long text, apologizing for not understanding how he felt all those years. I told him I'd try not to push him anymore, but I still thought he might regret not saying goodbye if it came to that. It took him a while to reply, and when he finally did, all he wrote back was, "Some wounds don't heal." It left me more confused than ever, but at least he hadn't shut me out completely. I updated my Reddit post, letting people know what had happened. The responses were all over the place. Some people said my brother was right to protect his peace, that he had every right to stay away. Others thought he was being unfair, that he should try to find some closure before it was too late. There was one comment that stuck with me, though. It said that sometimes people stay away not out of anger, but out of self-preservation, because facing those old wounds could tear them apart all over again. It made me wonder if that was what my brother was doing, even if he couldn't admit it. After that, I found myself thinking back to our childhood a lot. I started remembering moments I hadn't thought about in years. Times when Dad didn't show up and my brother tried to hide how much it bothered him, or when he'd get quiet whenever Dad made a rare appearance. I used to brush it off back then, thinking he'd get over it like I did. But maybe I was wrong. We exchanged a few more texts after that, nothing too deep, but one day he mentioned that he was thinking about starting therapy. He said he needed to work through some stuff, but he still wouldn't visit the hospital. It wasn't what I'd hoped for, but it felt like a step forward, at least for him. Now, I'm at a crossroads. Do I keep pushing, or do I respect his decision and focus on being there for Dad? Part of me wants to believe that there's still time for things to change, but I'm not sure how many more chances we'll get. Update 2. The hospital room is always quiet in the afternoons when Dad seems to have a little more energy. That's when he'll try to talk, even though his voice comes out raspy and weak. One day, as I sat by his side, he seemed more awake than usual, his eyes focused on the ceiling like he was deep in thought. He turned to me, and for the first time since this whole nightmare began, he started to really talk about the past, about us. He admitted that he knew he hadn't been there enough when we were kids. He said he thought he'd have more time to make up for it, that life just kept getting in the way, and he always assumed he'd get around to being a better father. He talked about all the things he wished he'd done differently, how he should have tried harder to be there for our birthdays, graduations, all those moments that ended up being more important than he realized. He even mentioned a few times he knew he'd let my brother down, moments I barely remembered but seemed to stick with him. Hearing him open up like that made my chest tighten. This was the kind of conversation I'd wanted with him for years, but now that it was happening, I couldn't stop thinking about my brother. I thought maybe, just maybe, if he could hear Dad say these things, it might make a difference. But every time I shared bits of these talks with my brother through text, he didn't respond beyond a simple, "Not now." It was like hitting a brick wall over and over. Dad asked me to pass along an apology to my brother, to let him know he was sorry for the times he wasn't there, how much he wished things had turned out differently. I told him I would, but I didn't know if it would mean anything to my brother, or if it was just too little, too late. That night, after visiting the hospital, I sat in my car in the parking lot for a long time, just staring at my phone. I finally decided to call my brother. He didn't pick up, so I left a voicemail, my voice cracking as I spoke. I asked him to please consider visiting, even if just for a few minutes. I told him about Dad's apology, how much he wished they could talk, how this might be our last chance to be together as a family. I didn't even know if he'd listen to it, but I had to try. The next morning, I got a text from him. It wasn't what I was hoping for. All he wrote was, "I'll think about it." I couldn't read between the lines whether he was really considering it or just trying to get me off his back. It left me stuck in this strange limbo, feeling like I was carrying the weight of both their feelings without knowing how to make things right. The constant back and forth was taking its toll. I ended up taking a few days off work, telling my boss I needed time to deal with a family emergency. I spent most of those days at the hospital, sitting with Dad, sometimes talking, sometimes just being there while he slept. but in the back of my mind, I kept wondering if my brother would ever show up. I posted another update on Reddit, sharing the latest from Dad, hoping that maybe the commenters could offer some perspective I hadn't considered. This time, people seemed to really feel for me. A few shared their own stories about strained relationships with parents, how they missed their chance to reconcile and still regretted it years later. Others said it was important not to lose hope, that sometimes it takes time for people to come around. Reading through the replies, I felt a bit of comfort knowing I wasn't the only one going through something like this. One comment stood out to me, though. It talked about how siblings can have completely different relationships with the same parent, depending on things like age or how involved that parent was at different points in their lives. It got me thinking about how maybe my brother saw a side of Dad that I hadn't, or maybe he felt abandoned in ways I didn't. I'd always been the one to try to keep things peaceful between everyone, but maybe that meant I'd ignored the things that hurt him most. A couple of nights later, when I was just about ready to give up hope, my phone rang. It was late, and I almost didn't answer, thinking it might be the hospital. But it was my brother. For a moment, neither of us spoke, just listening to each other breathe on the other end. Then, he said he'd been thinking about the voicemail I left about the things Dad said. He didn't sound angry, just tired, like he was struggling with something he couldn't quite put into words. He admitted he was on the fence about visiting. He didn't make any promises, didn't say he'd definitely come, just that he was thinking about it. I didn't push him, didn't ask any questions. I just let him know I'd be at the hospital every day, whenever he was ready. When we hung up, I couldn't tell if I should feel relieved or even more anxious than before. So now I'm stuck in this weird in-between place, waiting to see if he'll show up before it's too late, trying to keep Dad's spirits up without making any promises I can't keep. I'm doing everything I can to hold on to the hope that maybe, somehow, we can find a way through this mess together. But every time I walk into that hospital room and see Dad lying there, I can't help but feel like time is slipping away faster than any of us can hold on to it. For now, all I can do is wait. Update 3. After days of silence, I was starting to accept that my brother might never visit. Every time my phone buzzed, I thought it could be him, but it was always a false alarm. I kept visiting Dad, listening to his stories, trying to stay hopeful, but it felt like time was running out faster than I could keep up. Then, late one night, my phone finally lit up with a message from my brother. It was simple. Let's meet at the house tomorrow. We need to talk. The next morning, I drove to our old family home. The place had been empty since Mom moved into a smaller apartment years ago, but we kept it for family gatherings that never seemed to happen anymore. As I pulled into the driveway, I spotted my brother's car already parked there. He was leaning against the hood, looking down at the ground, hands shoved deep into his pockets. He looked up when I got out of the car, and for a moment we just stood there, neither of us saying a word. We went inside, and the house felt strange, quiet, full of memories, but with an emptiness that made it feel like a stranger's place. We ended up in the living room, sitting on opposite ends of the couch, like we used to when we were kids watching Saturday morning cartoons. But this time, there was no sense of comfort, just tension. He spoke first, his voice barely above a whisper. He admitted that he'd listened to my voicemail and that it had been weighing on him ever since. He talked about how hard it was to imagine seeing Dad like this, how it brought back memories of feeling abandoned, of all those times Dad wasn't there when he needed him most. I could see the struggle in his eyes as he spoke, like he was trying to keep himself from unraveling. I told him I hadn't realized how much he'd been carrying all these years. I apologized for pushing him so hard, for not understanding sooner. I said I just wanted him to have the chance to say goodbye if he ever wanted to. He nodded, but I could see the conflict on his face. He said that even though he understood Dad's regrets, the anger hadn't gone away. He knew our father was sorry, but he wasn't sure he could forgive him, or if he even wanted to. As much as I tried to stay calm, I couldn't hide my disappointment. I told him that I was worried he'd regret staying away, that this might be his last chance for closure. He looked away, and for a second, I thought he might walk out again. But he stayed, sitting in silence, chewing on the inside of his cheek like he always did when he was stressed. I suggested that maybe if he couldn't bring himself to visit in person, he could write Dad a letter instead. Just something for Dad to hear, even if it wasn't all forgiveness and reconciliation. That idea seemed to catch him off guard. He didn't say yes, but he didn't dismiss it either. He just muttered that he'd think about it. The next day, I got another call from the hospital. The doctors said Dad's condition was worsening again, that they weren't sure how much time he had left. They didn't mince words this time, weeks, maybe less. I drove to the hospital with my heart pounding in my chest, trying to keep my mind from jumping to the worst-case scenarios. When I got there, Dad was struggling more than usual to breathe, and his hands felt colder when I held them. That night, I texted my brother again, letting him know how serious things had gotten. I told him that if he was ever going to come, it had to be soon. I tried not to sound desperate, but I knew I probably did. After I sent the message, I waited, staring at my phone for hours, but nothing came. Days passed, and my brother's silence was all I had in return. I spent more time on Reddit, scrolling through the comments on my updates. A few people shared stories of missing their own chance to say goodbye to a parent, how it haunted them long after. One comment in particular hit me hard. A person wrote about how they'd never forgiven themselves for staying away, how they wished they'd pushed through the pain. It stayed with me, made me think that maybe there was still hope, even if it felt like there wasn't. One evening, I sat with Dad for hours, holding his hand and listening to him ramble about old memories, stories I'd heard 100 times before. He got tired after a while, drifting off to sleep mid-sentence. I stayed there, watching his breathing, wondering if this might be the last time we had a moment like this. And then, Just when I'd started to accept that my brother might never show up, my phone buzzed. It was him. He asked when would be a good time to meet at the hospital. For a second, I couldn't believe what I was reading. I reread the message a dozen times before it sank in. My hands were shaking when I typed out a response, trying to keep it short so I wouldn't scare him off. We exchanged a few more messages, working out the details. He said he'd be there the next afternoon. I sat in the hospital hallway afterward, staring at the screen, feeling a mix of relief and anxiety wash over me. I updated my Reddit post, letting everyone know that there was a chance my brother might finally visit, that maybe, just maybe, this could be the moment we'd all been waiting for. I didn't know how it would go. I didn't know if seeing Dad would bring the closure he needed, or if it would just make things worse. But for the first time in weeks, I felt like there was a chance, no matter how small, that things might start to change. Update 4. The day of the visit finally came, and I was on edge the entire morning. I kept checking my phone, half expecting my brother to cancel at the last minute. The thought of him backing out after everything left my stomach in knots, but I tried to push it down. I headed to the hospital early, wanting to prepare Dad for what might be a difficult meeting. When I got to his room, he was asleep, the steady beeping of the machines the only sound in the room. I stayed by his side, waiting. An hour later, my phone buzzed. It was my brother, letting me know he was in the parking lot. I told him where to find us, then waited by the room door, trying to keep my own nerves in check. When he finally walked down the hall, I could see the anxiety on his face. He looked different, older, somehow like this whole situation had taken more out of him than I'd realized. We walked into the room together and Dad was still dozing. The silence felt heavy, like even the air in the room was waiting for something to happen. My brother stood there, frozen, staring at our father who looked so small and fragile in that bed. It took a moment, but eventually, Dad's eyes fluttered open. When he saw my brother, there was a shift in his expression, a mix of surprise, relief, and a sadness that I couldn't quite place. Dad tried to sit up a little, but he was too weak. His voice came out shaky as he began to speak, apologizing right away. He didn't hold back. He told my brother that he was sorry for all the times he wasn't there, how he wished he'd been a better father. He said he'd been carrying that regret for years, even if he never showed it. My brother just stood there at first, arms crossed, staring down at the floor. The tension in the room was thick, like we were all holding our breath, waiting to see what he would do. After a long pause, he finally spoke, saying that he wasn't ready to forgive. He admitted he didn't even know if he ever could, but he wanted to hear Dad's side before it was too late. Dad tried to keep talking, but his voice started to crack, and tears welled up in his eyes. He struggled to get out the words, his breaths coming in short gasps. I could see how much he wanted to say, but he just couldn't find the strength to get it all out. I stepped in, trying to keep things from spiraling, reminding both of them that they didn't have to figure everything out in one conversation. I just wanted them to talk, even if it was messy. After a few deep breaths, my brother started to open up, his voice breaking as he told Dad how much it hurt growing up feeling like he didn't matter. He talked about all those nights he spent waiting for Dad to show up, all those missed birthdays, and how it made him feel like he was never enough to hold Dad's attention. It wasn't a rant, more like a wound being exposed after years of being buried. In the middle of this raw exchange, things took a turn for the worse. Dad suddenly clutched his chest, his face contorting in pain. His breaths became shallow and ragged. My heart jumped into my throat, and I rushed out into the hallway, yelling for help. My brother stood there, frozen in shock, his face pale as he watched Dad struggle. A team of nurses and doctors came running in, telling us to step back as they worked on stabilizing him. They pushed us out into the hallway, and the door swung shut behind us. My brother and I stood there, side by side, not saying a word. I could see him clenching and unclenching his fists, his jaw tight like he was trying to hold back something that was too big to contain. We sat down in the waiting area, the sound of our dad's strained breathing still echoing in my ears. My brother looked like he was on the verge of breaking down, but he kept staring straight ahead, his eyes glassy. After what felt like forever, he mumbled something about maybe waiting too long to come. His voice cracked, and I wasn't sure if he was talking to me or to himself. I put a hand on his shoulder, not sure if it was the right thing to do, but it felt like the only thing I could offer. He didn't shrug it off, but he didn't say anything more either. Finally, the doctor came out, his expression serious but not entirely grim. He explained that Dad had stabilized, but he was still in a critical state. It was a small relief, but the weight of everything that had happened kept pressing down on us. The doctor walked back into the room, and my brother just sat there, staring at the floor like he couldn't bring himself to move. After a few minutes, he stood up abruptly, saying he needed time to think. He left without looking back, leaving me alone in that cold, sterile waiting room, trying to make sense of everything that had just happened. I watched him disappear down the hallway, unsure if he'd ever come back or if this had just made things worse between us. When I finally got home that night, I opened Reddit and wrote an update. I told people how the visit had gone, how it had almost been too much for all of us. I didn't try to paint it as a perfect reconciliation or pretend that everything was suddenly okay, but I shared that tiny spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, the door hadn't fully closed between my brother and our father. It wasn't the clean resolution I'd hoped for, but it was something messy, uncertain, and raw, just like everything else in this situation. Update 5. After that hospital visit, my brother went silent again. Days turned into a week, and still nothing from him. I kept checking my phone, half expecting another message, but it never came. I tried to give him space, telling myself he probably needed time to process everything. But the longer the silence dragged on, the more I wondered if he'd just slipped back into his old habit of avoiding anything too painful. Meanwhile, Dad's condition hovered in this fragile place between getting better and worse. Some days, he was more lucid, able to hold a conversation for a few minutes. He'd ask about my brother, wondering if he'd come back again, hoping for more time to talk things through. Other days, he'd barely stay awake, his words slurring together, leaving me to sit there, watching the rise and fall of his chest, wondering how much longer we had. One night, after a particularly rough visit, I sat in a hospital parking lot, and it all just hit me. The stress, the uncertainty with my brother, the fear of losing Dad, it all built up until I couldn't hold it in anymore. I ended up crying right there in the car, trying to get a grip before heading home. That's when I realized I needed help. I'd been so focused on Dad and my brother that I'd ignored my own breaking point. The next day, I called up a therapist, set up an appointment, and started trying to sort through everything that had been building up inside me. It wasn't easy talking about all of it, the family history, the mess of emotions that had come up since Dad's heart attack, but it felt like a step in the right direction. Then, out of nowhere, my brother texted me. He thanked me for pushing him to visit, even though it had stirred up a lot of feelings he thought he'd buried. He said he'd been doing a lot of thinking and asked if we could meet up again to talk about what comes next. It wasn't exactly an apology, but it was the closest he'd come to opening up since this whole thing started. We met up at a diner near our old neighborhood, sitting in a booth by the window like we used to when we were teenagers. He looked tired but more grounded, like he'd come to some kind of decision. He mentioned that he'd started seeing a therapist, trying to work through the anger he still felt toward Dad, and even toward himself for staying away so long. It was strange to hear him talk about therapy. He'd always been the one to dismiss it in the past. As we talked, we started sharing memories from when we were kids. Some of them were tough, like the birthdays Dad missed and those awkward dinners when he'd try to make up for lost time. But there were some good ones too. We laughed about the time we'd tried to fix Dad's old car without a clue what we were doing, and how we'd all ended up covered in grease. It wasn't perfect, but it felt like we were taking a step toward understanding each other. But just as it seemed like things were starting to move forward, Dad took another turn for the worse. The doctors told us to prepare for the possibility that he might not have much time left. Hearing those words hit like a punch to the gut. It felt like we'd just started trying to piece things back together, and now it was all slipping away again. I let my brother know, and to my surprise, he started coming to the hospital regularly. He didn't say much during those visits, mostly sitting by Dad's bedside, staring out the window or holding Dad's hand when he thought no one was looking. He seemed unsure of what to say or do, but at least he was there. And that meant something. One afternoon, Dad managed to stay awake long enough to talk a bit more with my brother. They didn't have any grand reconciliation, but they exchanged a few words, enough for some of the tension to ease between them. My brother admitted he wasn't ready to forgive, but he was trying to understand, and that seemed to be enough for Dad. It wasn't the perfect closure, but there was a kind of unspoken understanding between them. I felt a strange sense of gratitude in those moments, knowing that at least my brother had this chance, even if it wasn't what either of them might have hoped for. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, but it was real, raw, and better than nothing at all. A few days later, Dad's health took its final decline. We were both there when he passed, holding his hands, the room quiet except for the hum of the machines. It wasn't dramatic. There were no final speeches or last words, just a peaceful, quiet end, and somehow that felt right. It was bittersweet, filled with grief, but also a sense of fragile peace. We stayed in the room for a while after not talking, just trying to process the fact that he was gone. After the funeral, I went back on Reddit for what would probably be my last update. I wrote about Dad's passing, about how complicated it had all been, but how grateful I was for the small bits of closure we'd found as a family. I thanked the community for being there, for all the advice and stories they'd shared. It helped more than they probably knew. I wrote that I hoped my brother and I could build something better between us moving forward, even if Dad's absence would always leave a mark on both of us. It wouldn't be easy, nothing about this ever was, but maybe we'd find a way through it together. And that was it. The end of one chapter, with another one just beginning, even if we didn't know where it would take us.